Well, earlier this month, the Caribbean nations approved a plan to seek reparations from the former slaving nations, including Britain, for the victims of slavery, slave trading, genocide and racial apartheid. And as a first step, they've engaged the British firm of solicitors who won £20 million compensation for the Kenyan victims of torture by the British during the Mau Mau rebellion in the 1950s. Should we pay reparations for slavery, for the evil of slavery? Esther. Morning, Esther. Well, let me ask you first, because what's really fascinating about this, and what a lot of people have not really focused on, are the ongoing effects. I mean, there is something that you've spoken about before, intergenerational transmission of trauma. Tell me about that.
Yes, well, basically, slavery and genocide has impacted not only the historical populations that were kidnapped from Africa, but also those of us who are the descendants of the enslaved today. And it's not only about trauma and multi-generational oppression, the whole discussion around wealth. There has been unjust enrichment to Britain, and there's also been unjust impoverishment, which has been passed on throughout the generations. So part of the legacy is this huge inequality that we see today between the descendants of the enslavers and the descendants of the enslaved. And
what about and psychological scars which have had societal effects, ongoing economic effects, to which you've already said? What are the psychological scars?
Well, part of that...
Intergenerational?
Yeah, intergenerationally, it's not knowing who we are. It's a lack of connection, it's a lack of identity, a lack of nationhood, which is what makes us human beings, essentially. It's not being rooted, it's being considered minority populations when we come from global majorities. And it's about having second-class status and citizenship wherever we have been located as a result of this dispersal and depopulation that happened originally in Africa.
And there is a phenomenon as well that you believe really does exist, which is post-traumatic slave syndrome.
Yes, well, it's something that I've not coined, but many of our social theorists and psychologists and psychiatrists have been looking at some of the negative legacies that we have internalized, the internalization of racism, self-hate, anti-African sentiments and prejudice and discrimination, a loathing of ourselves, vacant esteem.
Self-loathing.
Self-loathing. Self-loathing in terms of not being proud of who we are, not being proud of our heritage, not being proud of our African ancestry, changing our looks to kind of emulate Caucasian beauty ideals. These are some of the real legacies today in terms of the psychology. We also have to look at the rates of mental health illness, and this has also been linked to that.
All roots back to slavery.
All roots back to that.
Can I ask you as well, Fern, as you're there, I mean, you don't know each other, but it's wonderful you're both on the programme today, how it has affected, I mean, how has it affected you, Fern, slavery, you now, a woman in 2014?
Well, it's very important what Esther's been saying about post-traumatic slave syndrome and the trauma that's caused down the ages. And it has affected me because I've needed people to help me to get to where I am today. And I think if they hadn't done that, I wouldn't be talking to you today.
So you've been lucky in that?
I've been very lucky in that I've been helped to be where I am today by people who are aware of the problems that Esther has raised.
And as a successful academic, that's something you've had to battle against what happened back then.
I've had to battle against racism in particular.
But as a result of slavery?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Daniel Hannan, one of the things, of course, which is most egregious about this, many argue, is the fact that the slavers at the time of abolition, in 1838, I think, were paid enormous amounts of money, huge amount paid to the slave owners, equivalent of at least £16.5 billion today. So why shouldn't the people who are still suffering have reparations?
Because I'm descended from slaves, and you are descended from slaves, and everybody here is, and everybody watching at home is. Slavery was universal. We're all also, by the way, descended from slave owners. Human history being what it is, it could hardly be otherwise. Slavery was practiced in China, in India, in Arabia, in Africa, by the Aztecs, by the Mayans, by the Incas, by the Pacific Islanders. Muslims enslaved Christians, Christians enslaved Muslims. And therefore, if you're looking at paying reparations, anyone whom you choose to pay is statistically certain to be descended both from the owners and the owned. There were 3,000 black slave owners in the US on the eve of the Civil War. We are, if you like, all in this together. And it's therefore very difficult now to look at a population. I'm not talking about continuing slavery, which is a huge issue and where we could be doing a great deal. But if you're looking at past slavery, it's just a question of how far back you want to go, and we're all slaves.
No, we're not all descendants of, enslaved peoples and enslavers. I think that is really, falsifying history, and it actually is minimising the seriousness of what we're actually talking about. Chattel enslavement, as happened to African peoples and people of African descent, is something different and unparalleled in human history. And that's the starting point for this conversation. It's very cheap to then say, well, we've all been enslaved, because right now I don't have the same life chances and life experiences of many people who might even be sitting in this audience. I feel we need to understand this history. I'm not saying that we haven't all been impacted, but just to say, well, we've all been impacted the same is really not the starting point.
Yeah, and Bernadette, I'm sure if anyone wants to make a point...
I'm going to play devil's advocate here, so get the tomatoes out and start throwing it now. Look,
has it affected you? Okay,
no, and this is it. I think we really have to be careful here. Has all that got to do with slavery, being in a mental institution? I am a champion, a volunteer. I'm a motivational speaker that visits prisons twice a week. Now, some of the lads in there, their crimes are not for because I was a slave 150 years ago. I think at some point, yes, of course, we all know slavery was there. My God, bad things happen. Bad things happened to me once, but it's what I do. You don't walk around with it. You have to move on. We've got to rise above it now and start moving on and thinking, OK, what are we going to do in the next 150 years so that our children can see, this happened to my great-great-grandfather, but wow, look what they've done now. We've got to start rising above this and get away from you owe me this, you owe me that, and going back. Look, of course, every black person knows it's really difficult in certain areas.
What about the people that have profited from it? You know, the families that are still enriched
Again,
because of
we
this.
know this,
The
but what
tobacco
can we do?
millionaires, the
So
sugar
I live in
millionaires.
Dorset. What am I going to do? Knock on all the manor houses in Dorset and say, right, give me a room for the night, mate. You know, hello, where does it end? You know. Yes, they know. They are. Some of them are named and shamed, Nikki. They're all in Google. You can see who they are. They have been named and shamed. Almost an apology was made by Tony Blair. Yes, an apology. But the trouble is, no British government is going to apologise because that would open the floodgates.
Fern, come on. Audience, put your hands at Fern.
Almost an apology. Apology was not made by Tony Blair. He said
He expressed regret. Yeah.
Well, that's not an apology.
But there's a reason why. We know. I'm a realistic person. Let's be honest. It'll be another 150 years before they actually apologise and hand out cheques. And how are they going to do it?
Well, we're not asking for cheques to be handed out. It's not about money. That cheapens the debate.
Yes, I know.
It's not about money.
But if they apologise, you do realise the implications of if you apologise.
The legal implications.
For legal implications. Then the compensation, when my great-great-great-great-father, he was... How are we going to do it, you see? How are we going to do it?
That's not what CARICOM are asking for. CARICOM are asking for the first time ever, that the Western nations that were involved, such as the UK, France, Portugal and so on, sit around the table with 15 heads of government and talk about the issues that plague us now.
And then what?
And what the issues that plague us, God bless him when he died last year, that never stopped him. He's a millionaire. He worked hard, 7 days a week.
This is why we need education. It's very important. One of the things that CARICOM talk about is education.
But what has that got to do with slavery 150 years ago? Education, my dad educated me. 5 girls, we got educated. Not one of us would have gone wrong. I think all 5 of us has done well. I don't understand.
The point to recognise here is that we're not talking about something that happened 150 years ago. We're talking about the current impact of slavery, colonialism and neo-colonialism, which brings us right here into the here and now. That's what we're talking about.
In the order, OK. I know you want to come back on that. Hands up in the audience, please. Let's get some quick points. Yes, you've had your hand up for quite some time. Good morning.
Sorry, in terms of discussing whether they, like African Caribbean countries, should get reparation. It's saying that we've all been enslaved before, then why can't you, one question to that is why can't you correct it and show that it's not right by doing that? Also, the money that does go back can go into development schemes, and it is absolutely insane to assume that slavery hasn't got an impact. It's also like saying, oh, I've made it, so why can't you? You could look at victims of domestic violence and say, OK, you've made it in life, why haven't you? The trauma on those children and those children, people could...
Do you believe in the intergenerational transmission of trauma? Do you think
I do,
what happened
completely.
to your forefathers? Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
also because it's... If you're in an environment where there was self-hate, the problem is, you brainwashed Caribbeans, Africans, etc., and told them, you know, you're slaves, you're slaves, you're slaves. You didn't unbrainwash them. You didn't take it out of them. It has to be us building ourselves in order to remove that mindset. And society also has to open its mind. But you need schemes, you need things in place. We need economic power as well.
OK, let's address that in a minute. Anyone else who wants to just make a quick point? Over here, there was someone... I'm sure there were some more hands up. Yeah, gentleman at the back, quick one.
I think the economic legacy now, you're talking about Jamaica, which is spending more money repaying debt repayments than they are spending on education and health.
Exactly.
So how are the Caribbean countries going to move out from there when they're expected to do that? Talking about the freedom for countries.
And that cancellation of debt is one of the CARICOM demands, isn't it?
That's one of the things they're arguing for.
And that would have a massive impact, would it?
It would do, but what we actually recognise, it goes beyond debt cancellation because the debts are illegitimate debts. It's debt repudiation. The people of the Caribbean didn't owe anything, and the reason why these debts were imposed on them is in itself a legacy of colonialism that must be corrected.
Daniel Hannan.
Well, I just wanted to come back to Esther's point that Britain was different. That, OK, we're all descended from slaves. The Greeks did it, the Romans did it, but the UK...
The Muslim slave trade, of course.
Muslim slave trade.
15 million people were enslaved. Yeah.
Between 11 and 17 million Africans traded by Muslims. But let's just focus on what makes Britain different. What makes Britain different is that we extirpated this disgusting business. We were pouring energy, not into just the abolition in our own territory, but in wiping out the slave trade. Even when we were in a life-and-death struggle against Napoleon, we were diverting ships and men to stamp out the transatlantic trade, from which we derived no diplomatic gain, no profit, because it was the right thing to do. So if Britain is different, it's different in a very good way.
It's not. Actually, we talk about abolition, but we don't talk about Britain's commencement into this whole process of enslavement.
That's because we didn't commence it.
1562.
That's because
what
we didn't commence it. It had been happening forever.
1562. All the wealth that was generated that helped to make Britain great, so-called, the British Empire, all of this came from enslavement and colonialism and ill-gotten gains. And it links to this modern discussion around inequality and the huge gap between the nations, not only in terms of Britain and Europe, but also the rest of the world, and in particular, Africa and the Caribbean.
Look, Britain didn't invent the slave trade. There was existing slavery going on in Africa, which had been going on forever, as it had been going on in Europe.
It was
in the Americas.
Was not the same.
What made us different
it
is
was
that we
not
stopped.
the same. That is a falsification of history. What we had in Africa was systems of pawnship and forms of serfdom,
so it was
which
very
was
different.
Very different.
What about? So it's different from, because when this is such a fascinating debate when people have it. But one of the things which is always brought up is what about those of Irish extraction, for example, and 1,000 years of British history? Do they have an intergenerational transmission of trauma? And also, the British working classes, whether it be the Highland clearances or whether it be the mills, the dark satanic mills and the mines, the working class struggle. Do those people have intergenerational scars?
Yes, and in fact there are people from within those communities who argue that. This discussion around the impact on Irish people...
Do you think they're right?
Yes.
So
reparations is not just about people of African descent. No, what it means is that we have to understand our distinct histories and what has happened to specific groups. It's not just about putting it all into the pot and say we're all oppressed. We're all oppressed differently.
Do we all have victimhood, though?
Well, no, it's not about victimhood. It's about recognising what has happened and how do we repair the damage, which is what, incidentally, the term reparations means. How do we repair damage? It's not about compensation.
Francis Davis.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of Irish extraction, and I was of Irish heritage, so I was thinking about the Irish situation as well, and the differences between America welcoming a lot of Irish people and other parts of the world not being so welcoming. Seems to me that we need to be very careful, because Britain's track record in some areas is good, but 100,000 Croats and Bosnians left to rot as they came out of Vienna, the massacre at Amritsar, you know, people's bodies on balance sheets of English-owned diamond mines in South Africa. We don't have a good track record. If we go down
Compared to whom? Who's got a perfect record?
Well, nobody, but compared to lots of other countries, and you'd have to make variations even within Africa between the ghastly mess that the Belgian made in the Congo compared to the relatively balanced way that we came out of a country like
King Leopold,
Zambia.
one of the horrors of history.
Well, just a great, you know, and then you've got Pol Pot, which we forget about here. And it just seems to me that we need to step back and say, this is over now. Yes, we are sorry. Yes, we need to regret it. We can't sort it financially, except perhaps by overseas relief, except by debt remission, except by other ways of looking forward and rebuilding the global economy. But to keep looking back and saying, well, this passes down 15 generations, doesn't do anyone any favours.
But forgive me, the worst possible reason to embark on overseas aid is to make yourself feel better. The reason to do it is because you think it's making an improvement on the ground. If you go into it in order to assuage your own guilt and you're signing the cheques without really looking at whether it's making things better or worse, then almost certainly it's going to make things worse.
And James, just very quickly, and that's why we should be in Europe backing the Ukrainians who were shafted by the Nazis and the Soviets and pushing back against your argument on that one.
Right. You know he's a noted Eurosceptic. James, you've been, you know, I can see from your facial expressions, you've been engaged in this debate. Do you want to say something about this debate?
Sure. It's an extremely interesting debate. In fact, we had it in the car on the way down here this morning. We started it off. I think a couple of things. First of all, I agree with Daniel that these are terrible evils, and Britain was the country that stood by and actually, in fact, it was the Royal Navy, which was instrumental in stopping the trade. And I think that's extremely important and should be actually celebrated. And as you say, no country was perfect, but Britain was probably better than a lot of other countries. And so for us to sort of be the first port of call in demanding reparations it's just slightly strange, really.
No, it's not. And in fact, what trade? What slave trade? That's not a term that comes from us. In the same way Jewish people talk about a Shoah, a Holocaust. Yeah. For us, it was a Holocaust. Sure. For us, we cannot move on. And it's not a victimhood thing. There are two dimensions to repairs or reparations. Internal and external. Internal is what we owe ourselves, how we have to reclaim our agency and our self-determination.
But do what the Jewish community does then, and light candles and pass the
No, they do more than that. There was the establishment of the State of Israel and billions of dollars to maintaining it in terms of compensation. It wasn't just about lighting candles.
Well, should we feel guilty?
No,
is it about...
no, this is not about a guilt complex. It's not about white guilt.
But if you've
if
you have a transmission, an intergenerational, I have to write it down because it's kind of
trauma.
Intergenerational transmission of trauma
and depression.
Is there then? There was a story recently about Dominic Cumberbatch's great grandfather, whatever, was a slave owner. There are others. Is there an intergenerational transmission of guilt?
Well, I think so, and I think that's part of why this debate gets shut down and why it gets minimised. But that's not what we
really
want.
Interesting.
What we want is a conversation so that there can be greater understanding in British society as to how we've come to be where we are.
So that's about history. What we need then to tidy up history, put things that were deleted back in. Black History Month, this is about our community helping one another and passing the world on rather than going back, you owe me this, you owe me that. We need to sort ourselves out first and then we can spread the word.
Well, it's both, actually. It's not one or the other. It's both internal and it's both the fact that there are people today, families today, institutions in Britain today that are basically surviving on, thriving on ill-gotten gains, capital, wealth, assets.
But can you ever see a moment when it is over?
Well, there can only be over
well, let her answer. You asked the question. Here's the answer.
Only when there is justice, and there hasn't been justice.
What does that look like?
Why is it so hard to recognise the justice cause of people of African descent? There's a huge amount of complicity in this.
Ben Phillips.
Are we less than human beings?
No,
is that what you're saying? Does everyone else have a right to a recognition of their experience, but we must just forget it and move on? Is that what we're really saying? Is that what Britain is about?
For a long time, and people from minority communities fought heroically for the right for everyone to be treated the same. Equality under the law is one of the things that defines this country and that should make us all very proud, which is why I find it very sad to hear you arguing that we should be treated differently.
Equality equality under the law. That's on paper, statute. Why do we still have discrimination?
Okay, Ben.
Why is there huge income inequality?
Yeah, Ben, that's
wealth inequality.
An issue that Ben is very much focused on, as we heard from the previous debate. Should this be, given the horror of it, and I remember not knowing much about it, read a couple of books on the Atlantic slave trade, and they just jaw-droppingly evil and horrific. People being thrown off boats as if they were cargo for insurance purposes. It's just egregious and wicked in the extreme. Should this be a priority?
It was a shockingly evil part of history. You know, the reason the boats had to keep going was because the women could no longer give birth, because they had been so ill-treated that they were no longer fertile. And even today, the poorest parts of Africa are those parts from which the slaves were taken. Even today, the latest statistics show that the poorest parts of Africa...
DRC, CAR...
and the West African coast remain the poorest parts. So the consequence of this horrible history is still felt today. Yeah. And so anything that people can do, both to acknowledge that injustice, but also to make the world a better place, a fairer place, is a good thing to do. Aid is right, in part, because we are atoning for our history, and also because it means kids in school and kids alive who would otherwise be dead. So the work towards a just world and a world that recognises history is so important, and I think Esther's really set it out very well today.
Thank you all very much indeed. Now, you can join in all this morning's debates by logging on to bbc.co.uk/thebigquestions. Follow the link to the online discussion. And you can also, of course, tweet. It's hashtag BBCTBQ. Tell us what you think about our last big question, too. Can illness be cured by prayer? If you'd like to be in the audience at a future show, email audienceTBQ@menton.tv. We're going to be in Glasgow next week. We're going to be in Bristol on April the 6th. And then after a 2-week break for the London Marathon and Easter, we're bouncing back from York on April the 27th. Well, on Tuesday, it's going to be the Feast of the Annunciation, which celebrates, perhaps, the greatest miracle of all time, the impregnation of the Virgin Mary by God, resulting in the birth of Jesus 9 months later. On a more humble level, some Christians today claim to have witnessed miraculous events, believing people have been cured of physical or mental illness through the laying on of hands or the simple power of prayer. We have people here with us in Southampton who say they've witnessed events like this. Can illness be cured by prayer? I'm going to come to this side. We were speaking earlier on. Jeff, isn't it? Yes. Jeff, this microphone to Jeff. You've seen this, haven't you?
Yes, I have, yes. We believe in spiritualism that healing is brought through the forces and the energies from the spirit world.
What have you seen?
Channeled through the healer. I have seen a young gentleman who came from Australia. He was originally born in Bournemouth, moved with his family to Australia, came back some years later. He was about 23, came into our church for healing, which we do 5 days a week, and he looked horrendous. I can only say that, you know, when you look at somebody and you know there's no colour in their face, they almost look like they're coming to the end of their lives. His hair was just drab, no colour,
What was the diagnosis?
Shine. The guy had cancer. Yeah. And he had been sent from the hospital by one of the cancer surgeons to our church because they said there was very little, if anything, they could do for him.
So you prayed?
So, yes, we always pray before any session. Yeah. However, he came to one of our healers regularly, once a week, and he reported back to the church on a monthly basis. As he reported back to his doctor in Bournemouth Hospital, each time he went back, each month, they said to him that the cancer was receding. Right. And the cancer was receding. Now, we truly believe that we can work hand in hand with the medical profession.
Wow. Hand in hand, together.
Only spiritual healing healed him. It was a great asset to him and a great help to him. Now, by the time...
Why is it... It's cancer. Why is it... People always ask this, but it's a fair question. Why is it never amputees?
Why is it, sorry?
Amputees. Can you cure amputees as well?
No, we can't.
Cancer's pretty impressive, that's true.
Building another leg on, you mean, or
Yeah.
what? No, not really, I don't think.
No? But are you making an incredible claim? And then
Well,
you're saying,
I can only tell you...
Only so far?
Yes, I can only tell you what the young gentleman did after
Right.
about 9 months, and I'm not saying it happened overnight, it didn't. After 9 months, he looked so healthy, he was told the cancer had left his body, and he was cured.
Francis, prayer.
I believe in prayer.